echoing. I'm sorry. Is that okay?
All right, we are live.
Okay. Sorry. Hello. Um, like welcome to AMED and Women's Gender Studies Open Classroom. The title of the Open Classroom is Situated Knowledge and Critical Inquiry. Can the Subaltern Speak? We are excited to be able to invite amazing panelists today and share our discussion with students in the classes, the my classes, and also Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi's class. And Dr. Abdulhadi and I co-organized this panel, and we are gonna be co-moderating, directing the discussion, and we'll introduce our speakers shortly. I think I'd like to start with land acknowledgements, and so let me start. The campuses of San Francisco State University on the San Francisco Peninsula and North Bay are located within the occupied territories of the Lamaitas Ohlone and the coastal Miwok, who, along with the Southern Pomo, are organized as the Federated Indian of Greater Rancheria. And Rabab, would you like to do your acknowledgement on these topics?
صباح الخير، مساء الخير، مساء النور. Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches. We are coming together to meet, and I will say it in Arabic, that جامعة سان فرانسيسكو تقع، هي الجامعة نفسها والمراكز الأبحاث التابعة لها تقع على أراضي المحتلة لأهالي راماتوش أولوني وجماعة البيواك الساحلية، اللي هم بيشكلوا تحالف من أهل البلاد الأصليين في هذه المنطقة، ونحن نعترف أن هذه أراضي مسلوبة محتلة مستعمرة كما هي الواقع في فلسطين تماما. And I'm adding that we are also, I spoke in Arabic, I translated what Tomomi has mentioned in English, Dr. Kinukawa, and I'm going to add that I'm also on the east coast of the United States right now, on the Lenape, displaced and uprooted people, just like the people of Palestine, and we are really honored to be having also with us Palestinian resistance scholars, public intellectuals, fighters, feminists, queer activists who are coming to discuss this topic. So this is why we are here and how we are acknowledged and situate ourselves first. This is not all the situated knowledge, this is part of the situated knowledge. We also want to thank the panelists, as we did, Dr. Kinukawa and I, and we wanted to also specifically thank our TAs, teaching assistants, who are working with us. John Payton, who is working with Dr. Kinukawa in Women and Gender Studies, Gender and Women in U.S. History and Society, and Late Ghulum, who is working with me in this particular course, Gender and Modernity in Arab and Muslim Communities, as well as two other courses, Edward Said and Comparative Border Studies, Palestine and Mexico. In the afternoon, we will be again focusing at 2 p.m. We will be focusing the classes on Comparative Border Studies, Palestine and Mexico, as well as Dr. Kinukawa's other section in the course of Gender and Women in U.S. History and Society. We also want to thank, and both Sean and Lait are doing a very exciting historical and thesis, graduate thesis, MA thesis, in sexuality as well as ethnic studies, as well as in various other ways of understanding it, and we will be hosting them in the future. We also want to thank Salim Shhade, who's a doctoral candidate at UCLA Anthropology Department, who has finished their MA in AMED Studies at San Francisco State University and is currently focusing on analyzing, and I'm very happy to be working with Salim to document and historicize and put together the oral histories of Arab Palestinian activism throughout, actually we can go in like the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s and so on. And Salim is particularly focusing on the General Union of Palestine students, but also not only at San Francisco State, but throughout the, um, the United States and North America. And I want to also kind of like express my personal gratitude for working with Dr. Kinukawa. It's been a pleasure for us to come together. We will share a little bit about the history of how we came together. And I will turn it over to Dr. Kinukawa to speak about that. But it has been, though it has been a lot of pain, it also has been a labor of love. To be working together, to engage with each other, to struggle with each other, to experience the lack of resources, but also to experience how exciting it is to be able to have these conversations, to be able to bring such amazing luminary uh, people, public intellectuals to our students and to our classrooms and engage with our students, ourselves, our colleagues, staff, and the public at large and be able to have these discussions. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kinukawa to just frame how this came about, and then I will speak a little bit about why AMED open classrooms next. So go ahead, Professor Kinukawa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdulhadi. So I'd like to talk just briefly about how we started our collaboration and why we wanted to do this particular open classroom. So the way I started to collaborate with Dr. Abdulhadi was when I invited her to my introductory Women and Gender Studies course to give a guest lecture, not knowing like, and then she gracefully accepted the invitation, but then she introduced me to this Teach Palestine and the whole open classroom series that Dr. Abdulhadi has been doing for years. And then so we got to co-organize two open classrooms in the last spring 2020. And then so we organized the one on Palestine feminist militancy and academic freedom, and then other one state repression, pinkwashing, and queer feminist resistance. Those open classrooms were very like a great success, and based on those classrooms, we continued to do another set of open classrooms in the fall 2020, and that's when one of our classes got silenced by Zoom and also the SFSU, and so we were not able to actually do the open classroom, and so I think some of you might have read it about it. And but we have been continuing to do the open classrooms throughout all these semesters, and I think it's been just amazing experience that we were able to meet with like really the greatest minds of our time, really, and then the gay scholars, activists, artists, like all, and it's been an incredible once in a lifetime, life transforming experience for all of us. And so I'm really grateful for this collaboration with Dr. Abdulhadi and Ahmed's team. And I think it has been a challenge. Like there have been lots of struggles during this particular open classroom as well. And but so I think that's that's part of the discussion that we would like to have, like how we continue to teach decolonial, anti-colonial feminist narratives in our classrooms. And so like I'd like to learn from the panelists, like ours, methodologies and strategies. So Dr. Abdulhadi.
Yes, so this is part of, as Professor Kinukawa said, part of Women and Gender Studies and AMED Open Classrooms. We did start them in spring 2020, as Dr. Kinukawa said, and it's kind of like basically Dr. Kinukawa opening the space to students in their class to understand what is the reality of Arab and Muslim gender and sexual justice in Arab and Muslim communities. How does it work? What's the dynamics? How do we connect the question of justice for Palestine with the question of the indivisibility of justice and all. How do we actually discuss things without holding bars, but how do we also understand that we're constantly producing knowledge under the eyes, under Western eyes, as Chandra Mohanty said in long time ago, when she did an article in her doctoral dissertation, actually, one of the first ones. How do we produce that? Are we out of Western eyes? How do we produce knowledge? What sort of knowledge do we produce? How do we understand where we're at? And part of the reason we're actually asking about this is because oftentimes academics, not only students, academics in particular, produce knowledge and are sometimes not engaging in self-reflexivity of understanding where do we come from? How does where we come from inflict and shape what we know how to produce knowledge, and what accountability do we have towards the communities on whose lives we produce knowledge. So we were very happy to have three amazing feminist Palestinian women, queer feminists, come to join us. And we are going to be giving sort of like unofficial biographies we will post. They have so many accomplishments. So we will have Mahasen Nasser-Eldin, who actually did a filmmaker, but created a film called The Silent Revolution about a document Palestinian women wrote to protest and trying to figure out how do you take this document and how do you make it something different. So we want to be able to talk about that. What is the content and how did you do it and where is it at and what does this mean for knowledge? We have Manal Hamzeh, whose book on the Algerian women and revolution has really broken so many grounds and has taught us about the Nasawiyya Arabiyat. How do we understand, is there Arab feminisms that's different from other feminism? And if it's so, how does it work? And what is it? I thought Egyptian, I'm sorry. I don't know why I said Algerian. I think it's because our last open classroom was about Algeria, so slip of the tongue. About Egyptian women, and what does this really mean, and how do we understand that, and what are the issues that are not necessarily sort of so superficial? How do we dig deeper? How do we understand? How do we tell stories? What stories do we tell? And how do we continue to be true to the people we're interviewing and talking about them? And how do we engage with our own critical knowledge? And where is the balance between that? And how do we hold ourselves accountable when we're doing that? So how do we do that? That's a very big question. Also for any students, for anybody who is, and I'm talking about students, I'm not talking only about officially in students in the classroom, but I'm talking about students in general, of understanding of Palestine, of Arab, of Muslim communities, of questions of gender justice, gender and sexuality, transnational feminism, and so on. How does this work? How do we do that? And what are the tensions that we face, and how do we address them? And then last but not least, we have the Palestinian poet Dareen Tatour, who actually was silenced because she wrote poetry. I mean, she wrote poetry and she was silenced. She was imprisoned. She is joining us, and she is just having internet connection. So she's going to be coming and going, and she will be speaking in Arabic, and we will also be providing translation either ways. So I think maybe I will turn it over to Dr. Kinukawa. Do you want to, or who would like to start? I mean, we actually had the discussion, we didn't settle it. Who would like to kind of, maybe for history's sake, maybe we start with Mahasen, kind of like chronologically, not that we want to do linear history, but I think it might actually be easier to say, this is what happens here. And then this happens 1929, this is happening in 2011. How do you think about that? Students underline that, highlight it, and question it. With a big question, how does that sound, right? So for opening remarks, if you could just like talk a little bit about your film, what you were trying to do, what are some of the issues you could, and then we will move to Dr. Hamzeh. Yeah, go ahead.
Great. First, I want to say it's an honor to be on this panel, and it's an honor to be with you, Rabab, again. So thank you very much. Basically, the film The Silent Protest stems from research that I've been doing related to the Palestinian women's movement before 1948. But prior to this film, I made a film about Karima Aboud, who's one of the first women photographers in Palestine and probably in the area in the Arab world. So basically, the work on Karima Aboud opened up all these venues for me to learn, first of all, to discover this history, which is the history of Palestinian women before the Nakba, before 1948, before the establishment of the Zionist state of Israel. And basically, when we work on Palestinian history, let alone Palestinian women's history, I think we all know how difficult finding resources, finding primary material is. The archives are scattered all over the world. And then once you find material, it's very minimal. So the question is, how would you then piece the story together? How would you put these fragments together to make a coherent story? And being a filmmaker and a researcher in film, the overarching question that I'm asking myself all the time, and even the framework that I'm working within, is how do we construct historical narratives through image and sound? So this is where the story comes from also, in terms of, also the meaning of this construction today. So from the film, I think, you can tell, you can sense this urgent need to position myself as the filmmaker in the now, and then try to find resonance with the past. Because at the end of the day, I don't think of myself as a social historian, but I'm a filmmaker, and I'm using a filmmaking methodology and practice-based research to create my work and create the cultural product, if I may, to tell stories. So again, it's this conversation, this interrogation process that I have with the past from the point of view of today. I think this is very relevant. This is very immediate to the work that I do. And then finally, I would say that I think of this film and the work that I'm doing as a mode of resistance. Since, as I said, my work stems from this idea of creating historical marginalized narratives through image and sound, and it's basically this excavation process through the archives and in the archives, and particularly colonial archives. So it's one way, I look at it as a mode of resistance, really, into engendering, into creating, into uncovering this narrative. But again, this narrative, I think, is very subjective. It's also very much connected with questions not only related to Palestinian women or Palestinian feminists, but also other feminists, other marginalized groups, queer communities elsewhere in the world. I mean, from the film, if you have seen the film, one of the main questions, for instance, that I delve into is, when do we as women liberate ourselves, especially, in the Palestinian context here? Is it the nation first, or is it the women's feminist project first? And how do we look at these things and these questions today? Is the personal political, or is the political personal? Which is a question, I believe, that is being asked by women in not only in Palestine, but also in quotations in the third world. And the final note is the work that I do is really, I look at it as a collaboration. I am building around the experiences, I'm building on the experiences of other Palestinian women who have done work in oral history before me. And I'm hoping, women, Palestinian women, and otherwise, other women in the future would take this work and take it forward. So in a nutshell, the work that I do is really based on networking. It's based on acknowledging the work of others and then taking it forward. And for example, the work of Dr. Fayha Abdulhadi has been instrumental in how I in the current film that I'm working on, as well as in the silent protest. So yes, it's a work of, it's a collaboration, it's collective work, and especially when it comes to the archive and the question of, it's research in the archive, but it's also a process of mapping the archive with other people who are also working on collecting, on identifying first where Palestinian archives exist worldwide, and then the question of how do we start mapping this material to bring it home. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahasen. Actually, we're going to go to Dareen because her internet is not really that good, and then we'll circle back to Manal. I just wanted to kind of like keep us 2 points, is that we actually should say a little bit what the film is about, because we discussed about what the film, what the perspective, but not analysis. So that's okay. I think it's fine. And then there was a point that you've mentioned, which actually one of our colleagues says a lot, Margot Okazawa. Ray always says we stand on the shoulder of others. So this is really, really important in terms of the movement. So let's go to Dareen. Dareen will probably speak in Arabic, and I can translate. يلا تفضلي دارين. بس if you can speak for paragraph فقرة وقفي مشان أترجم.
بس الصوت ما وصلني أنا في البداية، بس إنه أحكي في البداية عن إيش الموضوع وهيك بس.
السؤال إنه كيف نعرف ما نعرف، ولماذا نكتب ما نكتب، ومن موقعك أنت كشاعرة فلسطينية قوبل شعرك الأدب اللي عملتيه بالعداء وبمحاولة إسكات الأفواه، ولماذا تكتبي؟ أي وراك العلم الفلسطيني كمان.
Okay. I think when the big important for me when I writing example, I writing only what I feel, what I hear, what I see in my life. I don't can to writing anything like a fantasy or something I don't live. All the time I write only about my life, my country, my people exactly. About the Palestinian people, about the life, how we live with the occupation, how and what we suffer from the occupation. All the time I write about all subjects I live. This is my my writing. I don't can to write anything I don't live or I don't feel. All the time and all my writing, the subject for my writing is about the feminist, about the political writing, and only that. I don't know why I don't exactly write another kind or another topic. Maybe this is because this is my life, because this is my feeling. And when I remember when they arrest me because I write poems, my topic for the writing is changes, and I started to write about the prison example, because that I think because when the poems when the poet live with some places, he he changed the topic for the topic for the writing. The places take the poet or the writer for what we will talking or writing. I think that this is my writing. This is my topic. What I write, and when I write, and because I'm a photographer, else when example when I write some points, uh, I started to find some picture to take and to connection the photographer with the poetry. Yeah, this.
Thank you, Dareen. We're going to come to ask Manal.
يعني
You've
عادة
analyzed.
إنه عادة المكان هو اللي بيحدد، أو الحياة بحسب رأيي المكان هو اللي بيحدد نوع الكتابة للشاعر أو طريقة الكتابة. فهذا كل موضوع كتاباتي أنا عن حياتي الشخصية مثلا، ما بقدر أعيش أو أحكي أو أكتب عن أشياء اللي هي أنا ما عشتها في خيال معين. فعمليا شخصيا الواقع هو اللي بيحدد نوع كتاباتي، وليش أنا بكتب عشان أنقل الرسالة. يس
يعني بتعكس الواقع واللي what I want to say is what Dareen just said, what was also she said it in English, so I'm actually there is no reason for me to translate now, but I think again we're now talking about actually connecting, and we will move to Manal next. We're talking about actually beginning is that why is your knowledge situated, what's the context in which you are producing, why you're producing what you're producing, what's the relationship between the image, between the content, between the imaginary, between the description, the whole question of, like, let's say بالعربي صوت وصورة, and the whole question of me actually good time to move to Manal and talk about your book, which also uses a lot of graphic and a lot of graphical imagery and constructions and so on. So why don't we go to you, Manal, and you speak about it, and then we will circle back into actually what is it that you exactly did. I love the way that we started actually from kind of like critiquing. Go ahead, Manal.
أول شيء بدي أحكي بالعربي. أول بشرفني وبزيدني تواضعا إني أكون معاكم. I'm very humbled and honored to be with you and the people engaging with us online. I will briefly talk about the book, my book, Women Resisting Sexual Violence and the Egyptian Revolution, and the subtitle, which was a fight with a publisher, is Arab Feminist Testimonies. It was supposed to be Arab Feminist Shahadat. And I wanted to put the Arabic in the title, but it was not so possible with a English focused publisher, which is Z, more of the better maybe publishing houses that are available for academics. I will talk briefly as I also acknowledge that I am up north west of Turtle Island on Kwandon Duns people's land, up in what is called the Yukon province of the settler colonial state of Canada. What I want to address very briefly right now is what I'm asserting in my work lately as an Arab or Arabiya Nasawiya methodology and method of research and creation of knowledge. And I used two methodologies / methods that are building on many feminists, including the Chicanas, the Palestinians, that are struggling on the ground, not only in the academy. I use shahadat, which are in English or in the Chicana epistemologies called testimonios. They are basically statements that are made in public to expose systems of oppressions and name those who are complicit with them. They've been used in the Egyptian revolution of January 25th, 2011, and afterwards. That caught my attention, and I worked more closely with them after 2012. And also the methodology and the method of Haki, which is according to the Chicana theorist, it's pláticas, which is also a form of bringing out knowledge from people through intimate conversations that are built on relationships of trust. And those are where I situate my humble effort of creating knowledge out of a feminist Arab perspective. That is also within my academic work. It's also driven by analytic approaches of critical feminist translations. So I work between Arabic and English at the same time, not only using translations of text and words of people, but also working those translations within the context and the history and the relationships that I build with those sources, the people who go through their experiences, specifically in this work of gendered sexual violence that is sanctioned by the state in Egypt. And I think I will stop here just so that we all share time equitably.
Okay, so I'm going to send it. Thank you so much. I think there's so much questions. I'm going to just keep my mouth shut for the time being. I'll come back. But I want to turn it over to Dr. Kinukawa about your own. I mean, you initiated this in your own class, which is gender and women in U.S. history and society. So why? What's the relationship? What is this whole Palestinian Arab feminist discussions and imagery and so on have to do with it? Why did you think this was important? Why do you think it's relevant to your work? Or is it, I mean, obviously it's relevant, so I'm not going to ask you, is it relevant? But why do you think it's relevant? Why did you do that?
Yes, well, it's relevant in many ways, in multiple layers. And so, but I'd like to actually I was struck. I'm like how the Mahasen first talked about this tension between feminism versus nation, and also both all of you kind of talked about this sense of place or the land, and I'm just wondering what I'm learning from your work, the past week or so. I have been reading and reading your work, and I feel that what you're teaching us, part of what you're teaching us, is how to centralize the indigenous notion of place and land, and by doing, and then see, I mean, in Mahasen's film, I was struck by the image of women feminists roaming streets of in Palestine and in different time periods, and those are just really vivid image for me, and that kind of redefine the meaning of the place, what's the land, what's the nation that we are discussing in our political work, and how the women and the feminist movements are defining the meaning of it, and also Manal's notion of Arabia, that was very new and very I'm still learning about it, but that's kind of questions us, helps us to kind of discards a colonial, imperial borders, and then the colonial cartographies, how they import the how the borders that are imposed by the imperialism, and then I'm sorry, my directions are going all sorts of places, but Dareen's I'd like to hear more about like how a place defines your work, and then when and I think, so I think Dareen's poetry too, it did for me, that kind of redefines the relationship between our notions of our understanding of the place, and so I just wanted to I'd like to hear more about the aspects, and also I'd like to ask Dr. Abdulhadi actually about you have been writing and sharing with us the history of Palestinian feminist movements, and teaching us how it is important to for us to be reading the whole history, and then also question asking us how to actually to question all sorts of the boundaries again that are imposed in our understanding of the history. And so I'd like to and then I think that to answer the question that Dr. Abdulhadi asked, I think this is essential. All these are essential questions for anyone who does feminism, and I think and especially against imperial feminism, that I think the visions and knowledge that you have, I've been learning from all your work, I think that is just that crucial for our collaborative work to reimagine what actually is feminism, as Dr. Abdulhadi was saying. And so I'd like to give it back to you, Dr. Abdulhadi.
Okay, so I'm going to just thank you so much, and I think this is sort of I want to engage in more conversations. So I would just I wanted to actually respond to a few things by way of talking about my work. Kind of the question is what's feminism, what's women's liberation, what's national liberation, what's community liberation. It's a process. It's a question that I've been actually dealing with all my life, and I really appreciate Hassan also signaling and shouting out to many figures, including Fayha Abdulhadi and others who have been historicizing Palestinian oral history narratives and so on. I'm just surprised about how much we write and how much we speak, and we still are not heard. And I mean, again and again, I always figure that the question has been answered, but we keep coming at it again and again. I'm always asking is that why is it, the question is, why do women participate in the liberation movements of their anti-colonial communities, but nobody actually asks why is it that men participate, and why is it that gender-based, in particular, kind of gender binary instead of non-binary and so on, why is that a question? The other question is rarely asked, and if it's asked, it gets eluded. The other thing I was thinking about is what is criminalized? What is it about the sort of knowledge we produce and we speak about that becomes so criminalized that the poetry that Dareen Tatour writes becomes actually basis for imprisonment, that discussion we have, a webinar, becomes basis for a campaign, international campaign, not only in the US, by all the Zionist, colonial, feminist, and right-wing white supremacists, as well as collusion by our own university to silence. What is it that they are so afraid of that comes out, that had to be silenced and crushed? And I want to also connect that to the current reality of the criminalization of 6 Palestinian human rights organizations. Of course, this is something that has become a big story, but we have heard again and again and again that unable to speak up. A Palestinian activist who criticized Palestinian Authority, Nizar Banat, gets actually killed. A Saudi activist gets chopped up to pieces. I mean, anybody who kind of like challenges the powers that be, there is a gradation of it, the silencing. I also was very intrigued by what Manal said about the ways in which they refused to allow the title, Shahadat, in the title. And I was very much reminded that when we were beginning to edit the Arab and Arab American feminisms book, and here I want to make a distinction between Arab and Arab American. So there is Arab feminisms, Nasawiyat, and there is Arab American, which are different contexts, which speaks to the situated knowledge. We were actually asked first time by the editor, why is there so much on Palestine? And you say, I mean, why are all the contributors, and not all of them were Palestinian? Why were they concerned? And we kind of like had to actually come up with an argument and say, but this is what people are concerned about, and because it's been a heightened program, it's not the only one. Now, I wanted to say a little thing about kind of like my own research and my own work that I've been actually engaging in what I call revising narratives, critiquing the Palestinian historical narratives, women's narrative, feminist narrative, including my own. So I know there is, my article gets cited a lot, but I am actually part of critical, and I will just cite maybe a small example that this was part of my undergraduate honors thesis. And I was invited to give a presentation at the Association of Middle East Women's Studies, which is attached to the Middle East Studies Association, like the biggest, most important academic association that deals with these issues. So I went to speak, and I talked about all the resistances women they were engaging in. I spoke about the phenomena of escort making people, women and people fall, about the ways in which Israel intelligence actually tries to entrap women and queers in particular to actually make them collaborators by using imagery that could be compromising and so on, which I think speaks a lot to Manal's work on Samir Ibrahim and others. And after I spoke and talked about the resistance, I talked about Palestinian women refusing to participate in that and how they collectively participate. One of the first questions I was asked was, so are Arab women's heads rolling in the streets? It was really shocking. It was very shocking for me. I was older student, but I was an undergrad. And there were all these very, very serious, well-known scholars. And it led me to the question of really thinking about situated knowledge. Where do you produce knowledge? In what language you produce knowledge? And for whom? Who are you speaking to? Who's your audience? And when you speak to the audience, is it possible really to kind of like reiterate Spivak's question, can the subaltern speak? And some people say, well, the subaltern never shuts up. Maybe the subaltern never shuts up because the subaltern has to continue speaking as part of resistance. But does it really get heard? Do the stories, do the analysis, does the lived experiences that we reflect, do they actually get heard? Do they, are people not only listening, but are they internalizing and interpreting and understanding what is it that we're saying? Or is it at the end of the discussion? And a lot of the times I ask my students, I assign Layla Abu Lughad article, do Muslim women need saving? And sometimes the students ask yes. And like, you want to pull your hair, and I don't think it's a question of the students necessarily themselves, but it's a question of how knowledge is produced and reproduced, which is part of the discussion that we're having today. I will stop here and we can continue the conversation later and maybe turn it.
We can't hear you, Dr. Abdulhadi.
I'm sorry, I shut myself up. I said, you ask, when I say I'm going to turn it over, I completely go to silent. Sorry, but I'm saying that you ask questions. You raise questions to Manal, to Mahasen, to Dareen. So I think maybe actually like addressing those and then coming back would be really great in your answer to actually say also, this is what I did. This is kind of like what the film was about. This is the particular poetry, the title of the poetry. This is actually what I did in the book. You know, kind of just to be able, I don't want to really make it too pedantic or kind of like oversimplified, but I think it's really helpful for our audience that haven't really read, haven't watched the films, haven't been able to read the poetry and so on, to know what is it that we're talking about, because we don't want to only produce exclusive knowledge where academics or scholars and public we're speaking to each other. We're speaking to everybody. The open classroom is really open. It's not just a classroom. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and I guess anybody who can take a stab at it and move on. Dareen, Manal suggests that you start. Do you want translation, or you good? If you need, we'll do it.
Yes, please,
Okay.
because I don't hear the questions.
Yeah. So what دكتور شو حكت دكتورة كينيكاغا وانا سألنا انه طيب كيف انت بتكتبي اللي كتبتي، كيف اصلا اسكات شو الشعر اللي كتبتيه اللي هو صار الشعر اللي خلاهم يحبسوكي، وليش حبسوكي، وهذا شو له علاقة بالمكان والزمان والتجربة اللي انت عايشة فيها، لانك حكيتي انت على التجربة، حكيتي عن الصوت والصورة، وبعدين طلعتي من السجن وكملتي، حكيتي بالسجن، قبل السجن انحبستي، وبعدين طلعتي وكملتي. فبدنا يعني نعرف شوية كمان يمكن تفاصيل اللي الناس بيعرفوها بس مش كل الناس عم بيسمعونا بيعرفوها.
Yeah. This started when I write one poem, resist my people, resist them. This is a point I write about the terrorists for the Zionist people against the Palestinian people, especially after the baby Ali Dawabshi, the murder Ali Dawabshi died. When the Zionist people killed them, and the child Muhammad Abu Khder and the girl Hadil Hashlamoun in El Khalil. All this, they are children, Palestinian children. After I see how the Zionist people kill them, I write the poems. I want to resist the occupation. I want to say something because I suffer too much after I see all these crimes against my people, and I don't have anything to do, only to write. And after then I write it in Arabic, the poems, and I publish it in my Facebook, and after 5 days they coming and arrest me. Why they arrest me? Because this is a political poems, because this is a poem talk about the terrorists for the Jewish people or the Zionist people do against the Palestinian people. The government, the Israel government, don't want anyone to talk about the crimes they do against the Palestinian people, of course, because that they don't want the voice for the Palestinian people to be, and after they arrest me, they think all the time I will silence, I will not continue. But I continue, of course, because this is my voice, this is my language, this is my life. Because that I continue, and I write too much in the prison, especially about all stories I hear. This is why I write especially the poems. المشكلة هلا رح أحكي هلا بالعربي شوي لأنه شوي صعب علي بالإنجليزي. المشكلة مع الاحتلال إنهم ما بدهم الحقيقة. ما بدهم يسمعوا، ما بدهم حدا يعرف الحقيقة. فدائما بحاربوا الكلمة الفلسطينية، بالذات لما تكون الكلمة سياسية، والشعر السياسي طول الوقت محارب أو يتم محاربته من قبل حكومة الاحتلال. فكانت التجربة تبعتي هي نوعا ما محاولة ردع من قبل الحكومة الإسرائيلية لإسكات الصوت الفلسطيني بالأساس والفنان الفلسطيني. لكن أنا كنت على دراية هذا الإشي، فأنا رفضت إنه أخضع لهاي المحاكمة نوعا ما. فقررت إني أفضح كل الممارسات الحكومة اللي أقرتها على الفنان الفلسطيني بشكل عام، وعلى الشاعر الفلسطيني اللي هي أنا عمليا أخضع لكل هذه الممارسات. هلا ممكن
خلينا
ترجمة.
أترجم. Okay. What Dareen is saying is that they don't want freedom, they don't want the truth to come out, and so they fight any expressions of Palestinian people, and they try to fight political expressions as well as artistic, literary traditions, poetic traditions as well. And so this is really an attempt to silence, an attempt to criminalize, an attempt to punish people from saying what they want to say. And so what I tried to do is I refused to succumb. I refused to submit. I refused to engage in submission of what they were trying to do. And I insisted instead to actually expose these practices, these criminalizing, racist, colonial practices, and speak up. This is really what has been my experience. I don't know who wants to go next. حسن.
في الشق الثاني من السؤال بس.
There's another part of the question. تفضلي دارين. سامعة؟
الشق الثاني من السؤال ايش كان؟
اوكي خلينا نخلي محاسن تحكي وبعدين نرجع لك. شو رايك؟
اوكي
بعدين نبعث لك اياه بالشات. تفضلي محاسن.
تمام. بدي أحكي I want to talk a bit about the film. Basically, the silent protest, Jerusalem, 1929, is a narrative about a day in the life of the Palestinian women's movement in 1929, and that's when Palestinian women from all over Palestine gathered in Jerusalem at the house of Tarab Abdulhadi to basically inaugurate to inaugurate their movement to the world, as well as to inaugurate it and proclaim it to Palestinian society. And this took place after the Buraq uprising. So there is something really interesting here is the timing of when women decided to tell the world about their movement. Now, this proclamation or this inauguration does not mean that Palestinian women have not been active before that point in time. Palestinian women have always been active. They've been active socially as well as politically. But it's this time, and it's at this point in history that they have gathered momentum, they have gathered the experience of organizing, political organizing, protest creation, and they were basically carving more space for themselves politically in the streets. So they were bringing the way I see it is that they were bringing their bodies to the forefront. They were bringing their bodies to the public sphere. And what is also interesting, and I think when we look at the images, of Palestinian women from that time, these are modern times, right? This is Palestine in modern times. So these images are of urban women, middle-class people, you know, who had access to education, who had access to resources, had access to the press, had access to travel as well, right? Had access to the train networks that connected different cities in the region. So they were traveling, they were writing, they were able to call the press, to form a press conference, to proclaim the movement. So also, you know, these women were in Palestine, but other examples of these women existed elsewhere as well. And this is again a point that I would like always to bring home, because it speaks for the culture, it speaks for the lives that existed pre-Nakba Palestine, that existed in Palestine pre-Nakba Palestine. So, you know, we are talking about the modern times, we're talking about globalization in the 1920s. Also, you know, women at that time were part of the international women's movement, calling for peace after World War II. There are numerous correspondences that we find in the archives between Palestinian women and women elsewhere. You know, talking about the question of Palestine. But then since that time, that question has been really a hot question that divided people, unfortunately. But my point here is, you know, this is a group of women who were aware of their positions in society. They were aware of the experience, the collected experience, the gathered experience that they built on, and they were aware that they are capable and able to actually form organizations and form organizational networks, and take themselves to public spaces, and take themselves and create protests. And to go back to the film, again, it's a day in the life of the movement. It's the day of the inauguration of the movement, and also it's when Palestine, you know, when these group of women, when basically what happened is they gathered at the house of Tarab Abdulhadi, and then they elected a committee that would take the demands, the women's demands, to the higher commissioner. So they went to the higher commissioner's house, they met with him, and from women's writings from the time, as well as later on, we know that the higher commissioner actually threatened them. And it's so interesting, right? I mean, the Brits, right? They wanted to liberate women in the East, right? But then when it came to serious issues and serious questions, they would bring the men of these same women whom they're trying to liberate to put them back in the house, to put them basically, you know, to put them back where they should be. But then, yeah, the British High Commissioner, he threatened the women, saying, you know, we will call upon your husbands. So the women decided that they would not go on a protest by foot, and alternatively they organized a convoy by cars, so it's a car convoy. So they roamed the city of Jerusalem in this car convoy, and they stopped at different consulates, and they delivered statements to different consulates on that day. So yeah, I mean, the film is about that day, but I think now, you know, the question is how such a film would be made, right? The content of the film, where the material came from, where is the space of imagination, right? Where I imagined what these women were going through. The film is based on a narrative, on a voiceover, and this voiceover is a construction. It's not material that has been written by women. It's material that I wrote from a standpoint of view of today, from the present time. But again, it's fed through material, through archival material, texts, correspondences, newspaper articles that I found related to that day and related to the Palestinian women's movement in the 1920s. So there's always this question, right, of whose narrative is this? Is this the narrative of the woman? Is this the narrative of the filmmaker? But again, you know, I think that with such work, and I think, you know, with also when we think of poetry, when we think of literature, you know, there is all this space of empowering us as subaltern communities that gives us the right, yeah, to imagine the past, that gives us the right to imagine what has been stolen from us and to reclaim what has been stolen from us. So in a lot of way, this film is my sense of reclamation of what has been stolen. You know, whether it's the archives that I found in Nantes, and then, you know, the archives are very static, right? So now, as a filmmaker, I am able to grab this archive, this archival material, decipher it the way I want to decipher it, rewrite it the way I see is relevant to the personal and collective story. And I think this is where the sense of empowerment is. This is where the mode of resistance is. So, you know, it gives us all the space to imagine our pasts, to interrogate the past through a lens that's very much relevant with the struggles of today, and what we see as women, as subaltern groups, as queer communities, you know, people who are living on the margins, people who are denied their stories, people who are denied their histories. And I also see, you know, this work also, and this is the last point I will talk about for now, is, you know, it's this really sense of empowerment, especially when I deal with and I work with younger Palestinian students, you know, of younger generations. And this whole idea of connecting pre and post Nakba Palestine, you know, meaning that Palestinian history does not start with the Nakba, you know. Palestinian history really goes beyond the Nakba. And this is at a time where I think, you know, all over the world, we need to feel this sense of rootedness from where we are, where we come from, and making the connectivities. Yeah, I mean, I love the way we opened the session, is really to make all these connectivities between people, between oppressed people, right? Because at the end of the day, we share the same grievances. So presenting this this rootedness, presenting this forms of solidarities, if I may use the word, you know, solidarities, to understand the present and project into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I have so many 100,000 questions, but I'm going to pass it on to Manal, and then we will come back to maybe raise some questions about what you've all raised. So, Manal, you haven't spoken about the book yet. So I want you to actually also talk about the book, and then maybe segue into Samira Ibrahim and whatever you do.
Okay. I will do a brief description of the book, Women Resisting Sexual Violence in the Egyptian Revolution, Arab Feminist Shahadat, Testimonies. Many people think of the Egyptian revolution as the January 25th, 2011, 18 days of people in Tahrir squares until they succeeded to quote unquote topple Mubarak. But after that period is the period I'm focusing on, I'm interested in, because counter-revolutionary regimes reinvented themselves through Islamist and militarist, of course, backed up by the US and Israel at that time. So I'm focusing on incidents and testimonies and shahadat of 3 women, particularly in the period of 2012 and 2013. And they take, there are 3 types of them that I'm focusing on. One is the military and the army detention of women and their subjugation to a so-called inspection of their virginity, which is practically rape, in military bases. That is one. And I have shared the testimonial, the shahada of Samira Ibrahim, who had sued the military in 2012. And the second shahada that I present in the book is of Yasmin El-Barmawi, who's a musician who had experienced for 90 very long minutes of group gang rape orchestrated by the Islamist regime at that time's police apparatus. And then the testimonial and the shahada of Ula Shahba, who's a political activist, socialist, that was detained and sexually violated by Islamist militias of the elected president of that time, Mohammed Morsi. So I did read and hear their shahadat online, but taking that text, I also, after I built relationships with them and had many, many conversations and hacky sessions with them in person in Cairo, I wrote what I would call relational text of the shahada. It is not a word by word of what they said online, but it's what they added and wanted to include in the book. And that is based on the solidarity-centered research that I do. And it's a cyclical kind of reciprocal kind of relationship between me and those people who want to work with me in the so-called research study. And it is not different. The theorizing that I do at the end of the book is my theorizing, but it's always in consultation with the women that I worked with. And it's not different from the theorizing that they've brilliantly done in their own shahadat. So I don't separate in my work between my focus, my work as a researcher in the academy, and that of the brilliant work that is done on the ground by the activist, feminist women, people who resist the colonial forces on the ground. The other part of this work, which is also a work of resistance within the academy, is, so to speak, taking in the knowledge that I produced academically to represent it in art. And that's what I have worked with 5 feminist Egyptian artists in Cairo to re-represent the shahadat of those 3 women in graphic form. And one of those was already out, was of Samira Ibrahim, who went through the so-called virginity testing by in military bases in March of 2012. And the graphic representation is, to me, revolutionary and a form of resistance, is because I am also refusing the only way of publishing in the academy, which is textual through peer-reviewed journals and academic books that come out. Of course, they're peer-reviewed, which is a good process most of the times, but they are read by very few people. So I am my humble attempt here in those two forms, the academic book and the graphic representation, is to share what I've learned with those three women and the artist with the widest audience in Arabic and in English. So if you can access the graphic piece of Samira Ibrahim on the nib.com, Samira Ibrahim, you will find the representation it's meant to bring a visceral experience to the reader and the audience, or the reader, so that they can in some ways not only understand and empathize with those women that are not only courageous but are regular people who have resisted in a moment that was collectively in a mode of revolution, where people said it in the term of "we are not fearful anymore." They produce a different knowledge, used different language that was very daring because it did use sexual terms, and also looked back in the eyes of their violators, their oppressors from the two regimes, the Islamist and the militarist regime in Egypt. In this, I want to say that the graphic pieces are in some ways a tool to bring us back collectively to feel together on our flesh what not only violence from the colonizers feels like, but what resistance also feels like. And my humble contribution as a last point I want to say is, I want the experiences of women, in particular that revolution of Egypt, to be remembered, so it stays part of our collective consciousness. Because when I was doing this work, I never forgot or stopped listening to the women, Palestinian women, in the prisons of the Israeli occupiers, going through gender-based and sexual violence throughout. It doesn't stop me from thinking of any kind of violation of women's bodies anywhere in the world. It doesn't have to be in the Arab world only. So I will stop here, and hopefully somebody could open that link to see just a glimpse of that representation graphically. And I want to say that the full comic or graphic pieces of the three women's shahadat is going to come out soon through Nool Comics. And very soon also a conversation with the artist will come out on the underground media source in Egypt, Meda Masr. Mm-hmm.
So, Dr. Kinukawa, back at you, or back at me, or what?
Please go ahead, Dr. Abdulhadi.
Okay, so I only wanted to kind of like, okay, I wanted to say a few things. One, I think I wish we have more of this discussion in Arabic. I'm kind of like thinking about it, and I'm kind of, we really need to have these spaces in Arabic, not only in English. And it doesn't have to have subscript, it doesn't have captioning, okay, because there's so many issues to talk about. I would, kind of like what's happening, when is this coming out, what conversations are happening. Two, is I was really thinking about how do we take this conversation more. I mean, kind of like today, we have the exigencies when the class ends. The class ends at 12:30, so we're actually extending it another half an hour, but the class ends. And so I think part of the challenge in the academy is that the same, I guess, what you were talking about, Manal, in terms of academic publishing, peer refereed, and so on, which we can have a whole discussion about that. Like, okay, so refereed, so what does this really mean? Why does refereed make it better than anything else? And who's refereeing? Who's doing the refereeing? And what are the relationship between editors and people who are being reviewed, and so on and so forth. I mean, I always receive a lot of, most of the time I'm unable to kind of meet that, but it's a lot of it, it's a crapshoot. It's basically who ends up being part of it and so on. But I actually wanted to kind of like say a few things. One, to Mahasen, I'm happy to say, I'm related to Tarab Abdulhadi and Fayha and all of them and so on. And I'm having said that, I also wanted to kind of like you were talking about the ways in which the women were constricted and they were placed in a particular thing. And you mentioned the Burak revolution. So I was actually thinking about, like, not many people know that, but, Dareen, I think Rena is far from Akka, but it's sort of like the 48 areas where, that's where the three Palestinian prisoners, Muhammad Janzoum, Atazir, Fuad Hijazi, were sentenced to hanging by the British colonial powers, which was according to Thawrat al-Buraq. And they actually have, which is very interesting, so many years after, there is a very kind of like honoring graves for them in Akka cemetery and so on, which is very, because it also speaks to the resistance of the silences. Silences, the physical, the material, the rhetorical, the discursive that Dareen has been subjected to, and other people throughout the history. So I think that's really very interesting to kind of like think about that. So how do we talk about it? Because many people don't want to talk about Barak revolution. They don't want to talk about it. And then the whole Zionist narrative, even though there have been contesting narratives of it, claims that it is another anti-Semitic incident, which is the same accusations that we've been accused of, the same accusation that Dareen has been accused of, the same accusation of the 6 human rights organizations, the people in May, in Akka, in Lid, in multiple places have been again and again subject, which is used as to kind of like take a very legitimate struggle against one form of discrimination and racism and using it as a weaponized way to silence Palestinian liberation and so on. So I think that's really very interesting. But I was actually also thinking about the whole. So this kind of brings in the whose narratives get told, and which narratives get told. I mean, I think this is. And Manal, you responded a lot to it when you were speaking in the process of discussing the book. But I'm just thinking about kind of like going back, and I love the silent revolution. I love the film. But it's kind of like the question, and when we talk about also Samira Ibrahim, when we talk about Dareen, we talk about the multiple ways, the multiple forms of womanhood, femininity, genderhood, peoplehood, that people participate. So now we're talking about an urban, it's more than middle class, it's actually upper class. It was kind of like, feudalist families and so on who've done that. Everybody should participate, but also the tools that they chose to go to the commission. And of course, it wasn't allowed. Even that wasn't allowed. It doesn't matter how much you clean up your discourse in terms of the colonial powers and how much you make it too radical. It's still unacceptable because you're speaking truth to power. It's not allowed, right? And it's not allowed to have women speak. Okay, so then the whole question of women get completely erased, and then they just put the men and say, this is it. The Palestinians, and when they say the Palestinians, it's usually the Palestinian men who are speaking again and again. And it's like you see all the protests, including recently, including Tali'at, including the May, including all the time. All of the stuff happens, and every single time, it's sort of like they'll say the Palestinians again. And the story of challenges by women, by queer people, by people who are not necessarily urban, rural, by people who are in refugee camps, by people who are in Naqab, indigenous communities, and so on. It sort of completely gets erased, and these stories get constructed as countering the same way, I would say, well, maybe not the same way, but in a similar comparative ways in the which that there is feminism in the US, and there is sort of like, then we say liberal feminism, then we say third wave feminism, second wave of feminism, and so on and so forth. But they all become contestations. So the feminisms of the majority of the people of the world, we're talking about the third world or the third world in quote unquote the global north and so on, indigenous communities completely gets erased because the story keep repeating again and again and again about a particular ways of what constitutes the body or the canon, the conventional wisdom. What is the most important? What's, let's say, the genesis, and what are the contestations? So then, I mean, like a lot of the times, and one of the reasons I'm very much intrigued by Samira Ibrahim and so on, because Samira Ibrahim defied all the ways in which what is supposed to be feminism in Egypt. I mean, for us, yes, but she defied all of that, and then she was invited by Hillary Clinton to be honored, and then Hillary Clinton realized that Samira Ibrahim supported Palestine and BDS and so on, and disinvited her, and that did not even have did not get much protest from feminist movements who kind of like spoke so loudly about the women's march and about the women of color who were leading the women's march and criticized the international women's strike and so on and so forth. So I think it's very, very interesting how these silences also happen within the movement. I guess the last point I wanted to mention is the whole question of standpoint, because Mahasen, you mentioned one aspect of the standpoint. You mentioned Manal, the Anzaldua and the indigenous and Chicano feminisms and indigenous and so on. So there is multiple ways. I refer to Chandra Mohanty and Under Western Eyes. So there is all kind of like, and then somebody said to me, why is Arab, what's different between Arab and Arab American? And I guess, like I will just say briefly, the context, but we can talk about that later. Is it the same? Is what we say, and is all Arab feminisms are the same? When we talk about Anasawiya Arabiya, is that all the same, or we're talking about a particular way, and how you're able to tell the story in a way that contests, and as Mohja Kaf said in her article in the Arab and Arab American feminism, she said in her discussion also of the girl in the tangerine scarf, she said that every single time the colonial feminist or the colonial mindset goes somewhere and says, aha, Arab and Muslim women are oppressed, I do a landmine. I put an intellectual in me. She makes it clear. She talks about an intellectual landmine. So nobody can say, oh, you're accused of terrorism. We're going to come to your house and arrest you tomorrow. So you have to be very careful about what you say and how you frame it, which is not something which is a luxury we cannot afford. We cannot afford because it's real, right? So she says, I established that. But does that really work? I mean, this is the question, is that how much, I guess, maybe does it really work? How much does it work? And then how do we talk about standpoint? How do we talk about where you're coming from and how you're explaining it? How do we, and I would say we can never stop misinterpretations. We never can stop that. But what are the ways to teach about it without actually, like, I mean, and I mentioned the whole assigning Leila Abu Lughadou Muslim women need saving, and then I'll assign also articles about Zionists, quote, there is place for feminism in Zionism. And I mean, sometimes not all the students are able to understand that, but you want to also have critical thinking. You want to be able, we're a project that's justice-centered. How do you do that, and how do you also engage on all these other multiple levels of silencing, multiple levels of talking, multiple levels of standpoint? How do we do that? And this is, and I'm going to turn it over also first to Tomomi, because I'm sure, because I know that you've gone into all this theorizing to say, why is it that Arab and Muslim gender and sexual just actually belong in transnational feminism? So maybe you can like say a little bit about that, and then we can go back to our speakers.
Thank you. I think, to be honest, I'd like to rather want to listen to all of you, because the time is really precious, and I'm here to listen, actually, then learn. I think that's actually my privilege to be able to do that. But just very briefly, I think when we did the open classrooms in the past, there was a pressure that was put on us to explain why this open classroom is like legitimate part of my class, which is Introductory Women and Gender Studies course. and then I had to explain and justify. I mean, like I had to like explain actually, like why it is. I mean, how it actually fits in my syllabus, and then and also there are some questions about like the courses about U.S. and so like can I include like like a feminist like feminists that are supposedly from elsewhere, and so and then yeah um so we were really like it was incredible that that question was actually posed, and then we are still like have to answer that question in order for us to be able to keep going, and so that yeah, so I just wanted to share that, but yeah, Dr. Abdulhadi.
Tomomi, you're not on your own of being questioned about your pedagogy when it comes to resistance and knowledges of resistance. So I want to also address Dr. Rabab's question on which feminism and which feminisms do we work with, are guided by, shape, and move forward with. The way we work with feminisms is not something static, and it's not a theory on the shelf. It is an alive praxis. So I do the intersectional feminist approach in my work, where I draw on and I stand on the backs of Arab feminists, Chicana feminists, indigenous feminists, and I, between understanding their place in the history of the movement and the knowledge production, not only movement on the ground, and understanding the current situation that is not disconnected. It's all interconnected on all fronts of struggle against the colonial settler logic and practices around us. I have to keep situating myself within those theories and practices, but also as an individual. And so how do we do this? Dr. Rabab asked. I do it, and I bluntly say it, and it might sound simple, by intentionally building relationships with the people that I learn and unlearn with, whether it is in the classroom or in a so-called academic study. It is through relationships. I make, as one of my Navajo colleagues call it, I make kin with them. And in Arabic, أنا ببني علاقات قرابة. So this is the way we situate ourselves. So if I am starting to that relationship with Mahasen, I'm gonna have to talk and have a conversation with her, tell her where I'm coming from politically, where I'm coming from ethically. Otherwise, I can't, or we cannot be transparent. And if we have differences, they're gonna come out in tensions that we will run away from, instead of take them as challenges that will generate not only knowledge, but generate kindness and love that will allow us to continue the resistance. So this is where I would say I come from in the way I situate myself in this world when I relate to others, whether in pedagogy or quote unquote research.
So I'm wondering who wants to go next, Mahasen or Dareen? I know Dareen is here, but she's shutting down her camera so we can have a better internet connection. Okay, go ahead, Mahasen.
Okay, yeah. Manal, I really appreciate what you just said, because I think ultimately it is about that. When I talk about, I think, like, first of all, the first step for me from my experience has been creating this realization, or reaching to this realization, that us as communities, we are suffering from similar or overlapping injustices. So the first thing is to acknowledge that our struggles are very similar. Our struggles in so many ways are overlapping, whether we're fighting for our land, whether we're fighting for our language, whether we're fighting for the right to raise our children the way we want to, the rights to education, and then now the right to the environment, right? So in a lot of ways, our struggle is becoming transnational, and I think which is something we have been denied of, to this collective thinking, okay, this reaching out, even the power to reach out, we have been denied of. We have been told that we cannot do that. We need to only listen to this white meta narrative, right? When in fact, this is not true. So the first thing I would say is acknowledging that there is this shared history of resistance, this shared history of oppression. And then the second question is exactly that is, it's how do you create these kinships, right? How do you reach out? How do you form these solidarities? I'm a bit skeptical of the word solidarity these days, but it's like, how do you come together around which table do you come together to see, to work together, to understand the realities that we are in. But I really appreciate, the way you put it. It is, at the end of the day, creating these kinships where we would come together as people who share similar histories. Thank you.
I think thank you. We're bringing back Dareen, and the reason is because of the. So we're asking Dareen as بالعربي، وين موقع المرأة الفلسطينية والشعر المقاوم؟ كيف تعيشي في مناطق ال48 كجزء من الحركة الفلسطينية والوضع الفلسطيني كله؟ وأنا بدي أزيد سؤال ثاني، إنه كيف علاقتكم كنساء فلسطينيات مقاومات وشاعرات وشعراء ومقاومين بشكل عام مع نقول الحركة الإسرائيلية، وممكن طبعا تصنفيها لأنه ما فيش حركة واحدة. يعني كيف بتكون المقاومة الفلسطينية في ظل مجتمع استيطاني إحلالي وعنصري بيحاول يمحي الوجود الفلسطيني والرواية الفلسطينية. So I'm going to say what I asked was where is Palestinian women today, and Palestinian poetry and Palestinian resistance inside the 48 areas as part of Palestinian reality? How does that work in terms of interacting, living within a settler colonial, Israeli settler colonial regime that basically really attempts to erase completely Palestinian narrative, not parts of them, completely erase and actually silences. And of course, you can answer whatever you feel comfortable with, whatever, because it's a question for the floor. But we're asking you to maybe respond to it. And sorry, I know Nasreen Alimi was saying my voice is very low. I'm really trying to make it louder. I'm just going to say I'm displaced from my home, so it's really hard to do it from a hotel. So just forgive me for that. تفضلي دليل.
ما سمعت شي.
I wrote it in the chat.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, قريب من الشات بضيف. I'm going to.
أوكي. بالنسبة للشعر المقاوم، مبدئيًا حقيقةً الشعر المقاوم لدى المرأة الفلسطينية جدًا قليل جدًا اليوم ما منلاقي نساء فلسطينيات شاعرات يكتبوا الشعر المقاوم، ما بدي أبالغ يمكن أنا موجودة وكمان شاعرات تنتين أخريات، واحدة من القدس وأخرى من الناصرة، لكن للأسف ما في شاعرات اللي هن بيتجهوا إلى مكان الشعر المقاوم، يعني بعد فضوى طوقان تقريبًا ما لمسنا الشعر المقاوم حقيقة في أراضي 48 بالذات، يعني خلينا أكون واضحة جدا، ما في شاعرات اللي هن بيتجهوا للشعر السياسي أو الشعر المقاوم، إذا بدنا نسميه شعر مقاوم. الترجمة وأكمل عشان ما
Dareen is saying that unfortunately there is maybe 2 or 3 Palestinian women poets who are writing resistance poetry, and maybe one from Nazareth, one from Jerusalem. And since Fadwa Tuqan, who has written and has passed away, there hasn't been much about that. So basically, Dareen is saying what we know as the dominant is actually reflective of what's going on.
فللأسف حقيقة لا يتم الاهتمام بالشعر المقاوم، يعني مثلا عن نفسي خليني أتحدث عن نفسي، وقت لما سجنت بسبب الشعر المقاوم سمعت جدا تعليقات جدا تافهة لدرجة إنه الإنسان بتضايق كتير، مثلا إنه بدك أو بدك تكوني مشهورة أو بدك تحرري فلسطين بالشعر، فكان الإشي كتير سيء جدا بالنسبة إلي كامرأة، ونوع من وبالذات خليني أكون واضحة جدا أو دقيقة جدا، يتم السخرية جدا من الرجال الشعراء لما مرأة تكتب شعر مقاوم. بصدق أحكيها إنه أغلب السخرية كانت من الرجال عشان أكون دقيقة جدا، وتصغير يتم تصغير الشاعر. خلينا أقول أحكي عن نفسي أنا، عانيت جدا من كمية التنمر، خليني أحكيها أستعملها هاي الكلمة، التنمر ضدي فقط لأني امرأة وبكتب الشعر السياسي والمقاوم في فلسطين.
Okay, I need some help. What Dareen is saying is that actually لأن التنمر I'm trying to figure out كيف بالإنجليزي، بس Dareen is saying kind of like I faced when I wrote and I was in prison, I actually faced a lot of what I might say silly comments, and they might not have been so silly, this is my editorial ad, asking, well, will you want to liberate Palestine with poetry? You want to be famous? Is that what you're trying to do? You're trying to gain fame? Unfortunately, I've heard a lot of ridicule from Palestinian male poets who were actually making fun of me, and so I've suffered a lot. إيش التنمر? I don't know. إيش التنمر? Is this like super masculinization?
It's partly it, bullying.
Bullying. Okay. So bullying against me by many of my colleagues who have really belittled and ridiculed me as I was a poet writing resistance poetry.
I think Dareen meant in general, people in general, not her male poet colleagues, right? Dareen مش الشعراء الفلسطينيين الرجال، هم عامة
بشكل عام، لكن أنا تلقيت من شعراء وكتاب فلسطينيين عشان أكون صريحة.
Okay, so she does emphasize that also male poets, Palestinian poets, subjected her to, this is misogyny at its best also.
So why do you think that is? ليش بتعتقدي هيك؟ يعني شو تحليلك؟ انت مش بالعقلهم بس
احنا يعني خلينا نقول حتى نحن مجتمع ذكوري، حتى الشعراء والمثقفين هم بيضلوا بالمجتمع الذكوري للاسف. يعني في شعراء وكتاب اللي هم تخطوا هذه المرحله، لكن اطلعوا للاسف بيطلعوا علي كامراه انا انسانه محجبه، فبيطلعوا كمان على هاي النظره. في بلاقي جدا انه ازاي انه نوع من التحايد، بيحاولوا يتحايدوني لاني انا انسانه بذاتي. انا اردت ان اكون انا كما انا، اعبر عن نفسي كما انا، مش ما بدي اكون مثل الاخرين. خلينا نقول انا بدي اعبر عن نفسي كدارين، عن المرحله تبعتي، عن الاشياء اللي بعيشها. هم ما بدهم هيك، بدهم انه انا اعيش المراه الفلسطينيه او الشعر الفلسطينيه عاشت عشان تحكي كذا كذا كذا، فانت بدك تكوني هيك بحسب هذا الترتيب اللي هم بدهم اياه. لكن انا رفضت هذا الشيء، وهذا الشيء ما كانوا بدهم اياه. فليش بعتقد؟ لانه
بدي اترجم.
احنا واضحين يعني، حتى في الثقافه في عندنا مجتمع ذكوري للاسف. وبظن كمان محاسن ناصر تعرضت لنفس الشيء بصناعه الافلام، محاوله التهميش المراه بكل مجالات الثقافه. عمليا نحن مش حالة نادرة، بفلسطين كمان موجود هذا الشيء زي ما كل المجتمعات العربية للأسف.
Okay, I'm going to translate because I think it's really important. I'm going to try to capture it all. I asked Dareen, so why do you think that is the case? You're not in their minds, but why do you? What's your analysis? She said, well, unfortunately, we do have a male supremacist society. We have a sexist society, and that I think also part of it is that I wear a hijab, and so I don't fit the mold of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. I express myself. This has been also unacceptable because I didn't fit, and this is not only in Palestinian, this is in all societies, in Arab societies, other societies, in the ways in which when you rise and when you want to say what you need to say, you are being repressed and silenced. I was trying to express myself, but this has been part of it. I'm not sure if I captured everything. I think and Dareen said also, Mahasen, you've also experienced some of it. I would just like add as Rabab that we have tons of experiences of that in my mind it has to do with how people can advocate like justice for Palestine, but not actually think about how it's linked to gender and sexual justice, or how it links to all sort of justices. Kind of like, how do you say you want justice for Palestine, but actually not think about justice for everybody? How could justice be divided? I mean, this is really part of it, but we also have a lot of experiences around that, and I don't want to kind of like move the topic, but this is something that, you mentioned. Do you want to say something else, Dareen, before maybe kind of like move to also dialogue with the rest of, yeah. I mean, so what do you do about it? شو بتعملي؟ كيف بتقاومي؟ قاوم يا شعبي،
كيف بقاوم؟ يعني
كيف تقاوم دارين؟
حقيقة الكتابة هي الوسيلة الوحيدة لإلي، التصوير كمان أيضا، نقل الرسالة. اليوم عم بشتغل إنه أترجم أشعاري كتاباتي للغة الإنجليزية وللغات أخرى. بالصدفة بالفعل تم ترجمة الكتاباتي لعدة لغات، مش ليس فقط اللغة الإنجليزية، وهذا إشي بيساعدني. والإشي اللي أنا بحزنني جدا إنه أنا أسمع مثلا شعر دارين ليس شعرا في اللغة العربية من الفلسطينيين كمان كتير، لكن عم بقوم بإرسال رسالة جدا أكثر من كتير ناس. مش أنا بدي أحكي عن نفسي، لكن عم بقوم بنقل رسالة حقيقة جدا بالنسبة إلي. أنا أعتبر إنه عم بأدي رسالة اللي ما حدا كتير قدر يعملها. اللي بيحكوا إنه شعر دارين ضعيف جدا، واللي بيحكوا إنه شعر دارين ما عم بيعطي الرسالة الصحيحة، لكن في نسبة كبيرة من اللي عايشين في أوروبا اللي ما كانوا يعرفوا أصلاً مين هم ال48. أنا نقلت الرسالة وعرفت كيف أنقل الرسالة تبعتي بشكل بسيط جداً بلغتي حتى الإنجليزية اللي سمعتوها، اللي هي جداً بسيطة، لكن قدرت إنه أعبر عن نفسي وقدرت أعبر عن شريحة نساء فلسطينيات. ولا تنسوا كمان إنه أنا بكتب عن التحرش وعن الاغتصاب، كوني أنا واحدة من اللي تعرضوا لهذا الشيء، وأنا كسرت هذا الحاجز عملياً وحكيت وطلعت بحركة من فلسطين اللي هي أنا كمان، اللي هي شبيهة بحركة ميتو في أوروبا. وهذا الشيء كان بالنسبة لهم إنه هذا الإشي غلط، هذا الإشي جدا مش صحيح، أو نوعا ما إنه بدهم يحاربوه بأي طريقة. فهم ما بدهم الصوت النسائي يطلع الطريقة اللي أنا بدي إياها، بدهم إياه يطلع حسب كيف هم بدهم. وهذا الشيء أنا طبعاً رفضته. حتى طريقة الكتابة تبعتي هي المقاومة، مش فقط مقاومة سياسية. أنا عندي أغلبية كتاباتي هي حث المرأة على المقاومة ضد الرجل، ضد الذكورية، ضد الصمت. اللي بيقرأ أشعاري بحس هذا الشيء عمليا. فللأسف أنا اخترت هذا الطريق وراح أكمل فيه طبعا، بغض النظر مين وافق ومين ما وافق. والحمد لله يعني أنا مقتنعة في الشيء وعم بنجح. والدليل إنه انتشرت الكتاب الأول تبعي في الإنجليزي، وفي عليه يعني عمليا مبيعات هائلة جدا. وعمليا ما حدا كان يسمع على شيء اسمه قديش إسرائيل أو قديش الاحتلال هو ديكتاتوري، وقديش ما في حق حرية تعبير للفلسطينيين بال48. أسف نسيت إنه في ترجمة.
ما هو أنا ما أقطعك لأنك عم تحكي كتير. أوكي، ما بدي أقطع حبل أفكارك، بس I want to say that what Dareen was saying is that some of the things were said that my poetry is weak, but the thing is it's been translated to English, being translated to other languages. I express myself the way I feel that I want to express myself, but there is a certain criticism that thinks that the way you express Palestine, you need to express it in a particular way, which I am defying. Basically, what Dareen is doing is defying the mold of how things are supposed to be, and I'm delivering the message. And many people did not even know what was going on in the 48 areas. I'm speaking about that, and I'm happy. I'm proud to be able to speak about that. I also want to say that I also spoke about sexual harassment. I spoke about rape. I also mentioned I broke this taboo of what we are speaking about, and I'm speaking about Palestine. And this is something kind of like maybe even connecting with the Me Too movement and so on. That is something that maybe they don't like to hear, and they don't think that this is the appropriate way to say it. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to stop. I'm going to continue doing what I want to do and what I am saying, and I'm going to speak and basically spread the word around. And I'm kind of like, I want to, I don't, if you want to say a few more words, Dareen, but I'm going to just say a couple of words myself. And I think this is really, it's kind of like when we think about what is resistance, what is women's resistance, what constitutes as resistance, what constitutes as situated knowledge, and why is that all important, and why is it kind of like we defy the question of kind of like there is a particular way of telling what Palestinian narratives are, that some of it actually is suppressive of what the resistance narrative can be about. I mean, this is kind of like, so where is it that you say here, this is not allowed? And I think it may be sort of another aspect of thinking there are certain things you cannot discuss. So one of the things about Palestinian history is that people can talk about everything that has happened in the 1910s, but the closer you get to the present about resistance, is not allowed. It's not allowed because people are alive. A dead Palestinian is a good Palestinian, but an alive Palestinian who speak for themselves, for herself and so on, is not, because actually that breaks the mold of what. So it also speaks about how do we think about social movements? How do we think about resistance? How do we think about liberation? How do we actually think, not in a liberal way of having 100,000 flowers bloom? How do we actually express solidarity? And now I'm going to bring in solidarity not in the way that maybe you criticize it, Mahasen, but in a way that there is collective solidarity, social solidarity. The way solidarity started and talking about workers' solidarity, talking about an injury to one is an injury to all, bringing people together. How do we do that in terms of us to be critical? It's okay to be critical and disagree and agree and disagree, but at the same time, we're also building a different kind of community. So I wanna like throw it back at both of you, and actually all of you, Manal, Mahasen, and Tuwami, and maybe, come back. We have 12 minutes and we've answered all the questions, so it's okay for us to have a conversation. So I don't know who wants to take a crack first and respond to the call that Dareen issued the call. So what are the responses?
If I may make a statement, because I've also been thinking about, as women, it's about how we manage our lives day by day, so it's about writing the history or writing our narratives of how we go about on daily basis fighting occupation on daily basis, being, carrying out the roles that are expected of us. And that also speaks about the way we resist. So it's actually going to to the micro of how women, how we go by our days. If we're mothers, if we're educators, if we're poets, if we're writers, so it's also sharing these experiences of the day-to-day experiences, the day-to-day struggles. When I think about the women that I'm researching, right, it's not only about them going out in the streets and organizing a protest. It's actually about how also they negotiated what they wanted to do in their homes, in their private spheres, vis-a-vis their husbands, vis-a-vis the males in their families, or in the communities, in their communities. So again, it's for me, it's going back to thinking about our experiences as women, and as how we negotiate what we want, how we negotiate the structures of oppression that are to this day imposed on us. Like what Dareen just talked about, which we all face as women. We're always told that we are inapt. We cannot write good poetry, or poetry that fits whatever is expected. We cannot make good films, or we make quasi films, right? Like they're not serious, they're semi-serious films, semi-serious academia, literature. So yeah, I think it's also going into I think I would call it the day-to-day negotiation of life. Thank you.
Manal?
You are all filling my heart and also my mind with a lot of questions. But before I share my last statement, I want to speak in Arabic with Dareen. Dareen, سمعتيني؟ But I'm going to say.
I don't think it's a problem, because we will be taping it and Dareen can hear it later on too.
دارين بدي أقول إنه أنا معاكي موقفة معك. الكلمة المكتوبة والمحكية هي خنجر بمنطق، بديش أكون عنيفة، بمنطق الاستعمار الاستيطاني وبالأخص الإسرائيلي. وبرضه لأنه الاستعمار الاستيطاني مبني يا دارين على منطق الذكورية والسلطة الذكورية، الرجال الذكوريين حولك برضه بنهزوا. فاستمري، وكلمتك قوية ومهمة جدا للمقاومة، مش بس الفلسطينية، المقاومة في كل العالم. I was just saluting and standing in solidarity with Dareen for her use of the word and poetry to counter the logic and the practices of settler colonialism, especially Israeli settler colonialism, which is also based on patriarchal logics and structures. And my last statement on this is that as an academic Arab Palestinian of Palestinian grandparents, I work within the U.S. Academy on the borders of Mexico and the U.S. At the southern city of Las Cruces in the University of New Mexico State University. We are actually at this moment in struggle and in a fight to make borderlands and ethnic studies a department. It's been a struggle of 10 years of many colleagues that are now have become a collective, drawing support from the community, from indigenous leaders, from school boards and teachers all over the state to bring in this collective of faculty to begin to teach critical ethnic studies, which would include Palestine. So it's a struggle that we are also learning from the struggle of Rabab, Abdulhadi, and other people in the UX Academy, is not to let go and always be a collective so that they can't break us. Rabab's struggle with the university, San Francisco State University, is also because they made sure to put her in a condition of being alone and not in a group of faculty, so that they can, as much as they can, sort of break her. But she has a collective outside the university that have been around her. So my last word is that we continue to struggle on many fronts, including the academy in the US and in our world. I do this kind of work also in Jordan. So it's important to realize that we need to stay together, not in symbolic solidarity, but in actual, practical, loving solidarity, so that we can stay grounded and continue this fight until we go around the colonial system. I don't want to beat it up. I don't want to be violent to a structure that I think is already dying.
Thank you so much. I think we lost Dr. Abdulhadi's connection, Rabab. So, and then, but I'd like to talk about just very briefly that talking about solidarity. Like the first time I met with Rabab for Dr. Abdulhadi in person was when she came to memorial that we've created in San Francisco to memorialize the victims and survivors of the Japanese military sexual slavery system from 1930s to 1945, and so so I think that's symbolic, and I think when I learn about like her work and like your work, I do that through my activism about like the around that issue, and which was started by the survivors and victims of the system that they spoke up in the 1991 for the first time, although like in like that Japan was defeated in 1945. And so that as I listened to your and so I think that like I really do appreciate that, like in the ways which Dr. Abdulhadi and AMED have been really pivotal in making those connections in our local communities and also on campus, and then today, like and then through all these classes, and so I feel very much privileged and honored to be able to work in that, like in the work of solidarity. And so just wanted to add that. And I think, I'd like to also, I think we should mention the second webinar today. So we have another webinar that is planned at 2 p.m. In the Pacific time, 5 p.m. in the East Coast. And so it's titled The Gender and Sexual Justice from Kashmir to Mexico, Haiti to Palestine and Zionist Korean Communities. And we have the panelists Humada, Mia Kim, Luna Martinez, Namia Prosper, and so if you can please do join and the second discussion today. And Dr. Abdulhadi, would you like to say?
Yeah, I'm just going to ask Lait if you can just post it in the chat so people know where it is at. And just basically to conclude by thanking you all, I wanted to also kind of like segue into what Dr. Hamzeh was saying, because we were going to do a whole series of comparative border studies and indigenous studies with your department that you've been struggling on. Unfortunately, with the whole silencing of our webinar and our loss of our ability to post on YouTube and being shut down by Zoom and not getting the support of the university, we really have to do this on the fly. And so we would like to do that. And then we were supposed to do another one this past semester because it was 20 years since 9/11, 2001, and discuss whose narratives. But then the university went and canceled the class, Civil Liberties of Arabs and Muslims post 9/11, 2001, that basically deprived us of the space where we can do it. However, we're really happy. I will speak, I mean, on my behalf, on behalf of Dr. Kinukawa, and also on behalf of all our students and communities out there. This is really has been a very valuable conversation. It is just starting. It doesn't end. We want to be able to see how are we going to make it possible for Dareen's poetry to be translated not only to English, but also the other languages that maybe matter more to our communities. How can we have this conversation more in Arabic? How can we have show the film and be able to discuss the film? How can we have Manal speak about your book and have more people look at the graphics and go maybe like slide by slide and be able to engage more? The time in the classrooms we only have an hour and a half, 2 hours max. But it's a question of how do we do that? How do we bring being back in person? And how do we connect with the internet? And how do we actually are able to bring all our communities? With that said, I mean, I'm just really honored and very happy to have you all. You've been amazing. This is really the spirit of what resistance looks like. One slice, it's not all the slice, but it's one slice that is very valuable, that is really important. And that is something that we will bring to our students, we'll bring to our communities, we'll bring to everybody. And it's just been such a pleasure and such food for thought and so energizing just to be with all of you here. So we really want to thank you. And it will be online. So you can please share it with people and so on, get feedback, critique, and love you all. And as we say, the struggle continues. Another word is possible, and justice is indivisible, and so is justice in for Palestine. So thank you.